Morning, everyone. Just waiting for a few more people to join, and then we'll start this session. Morning, everyone, and welcome. Hope you're well, keeping safe. My name's Richard Enderby, so I head up the security practice inside of CDW, and today I'm joined by Rich Davis, who's the cybersecurity strategist for Proofpoint, and we're going to be talking about the new risk landscape and how that affects people in kind of today's modern world. So I just want to set the scene a little bit and provide some context for this discussion. If you have any questions, then please feel free to ask them during the session, and we'll look to answer them as well. So 3 months on, we're starting to see a return to the office, but this is still limited, and organisations, are putting in measures for like social distancing, as I'm sure you're aware, and some stating that actually that whole return won't really happen until next year in any kind of shape and form. If we look at some of the statistics out there and reports, people like Gartner have done, more organisations, or 76% of organisations, are actually adopting remote working for more than 50% of their staff, and in some cases, I think 2% of those organisations are going to have at least 50% working from home permanently. So this is definitely a new norm, a new way of working for some people, and this is going to be in place for some time to come. That move as well, happened at an unprecedented rate, and I think most organisations done a fairly decent job of moving their workforce to home, and to be honest, it's not something that I've really experienced in this way in over 25 years in IT. Again, you would have had like DR scenarios and systems in place to allow users to work from home. Those kind of systems have been in place for a long time now, but probably would have only been set up to work for a short period of time, and hadn't really planned for extended amount of working from home, especially on a permanent basis. And then there were some challenges around that. Obviously not everyone probably would have had a work device or a company issued device or a laptop, and in some cases, with the global pandemic, there was a shortage as well on purchasing these items. So there's been some challenges for organisations out there. Employees have had to use their own devices. And again, those bring an increased risk to the organisation as well. Talking of risk, one of those challenges that we need to address is security that's posed to users. And I don't mean just the identity of those users, where you can inform to enhance authentication with multi-factor, etc. I mean, that's pretty important, but I mean protecting users from emails that contain malware, and cleverly crafted like phishing attacks as well. We've seen a huge amount of phishing on the rise, especially around COVID itself. So that's been quite important. And then alongside that, the education for those users. I find that users' mindsets inside the office are somewhat different to when they're at home. They're using different devices, and there's also a different amount of protections in place as well. People, obviously protected using corporate email or corporate security products for their email, whether inside the network and when they're using the corporate device. But, those kind of home email addresses or personal email addresses wouldn't have had the same amount of protections. And in some cases, what we've seen is actually people's home email addresses, actually their personal email, being targeted a lot more with phishing, and they become harder to detect as well. Especially on a phone or a tablet. And in fact, even myself, I received an email last week. I was speaking to Rich about this last week, around my TV license, about renewal of my TV license. It actually looked like a perfectly legitimate email. But once I actually investigated it and looked at reputation-based analysis around the links inside that email, I actually found it probably to be more malicious than good. that's fine for me to do, but the average user wouldn't really know how to perform these kind of checks and might actually click on the link and therefore become compromised. So there's just a few thoughts for myself. Obviously I've got Rich on the phone from Proofpoint, and I suppose my first question really is to actually to Rich around what Proofpoint are seeing out there in the market. There's you've got something like over 100,000 customers out there. You provide a huge amount of email security services to those customers. So you've probably got a great visibility into, the threat landscape. So, Rich, what have you been seeing over the last few months?
Yeah, and firstly, just want to say good morning to everybody that's joined. It's great to be here and great to be presenting with you, Richard. So I think we can really just sum this up in a very simple way. The threat actors have realized that by far the most effective lure out there right now is to focus on the pandemic and focus on that social engineering piece of fear, uncertainty, and doubt across everybody, and we see this across all of the lures. If I just bring up a quick graph, this is a kind of a representation of all of the threats that we've seen globally across our 120,000 plus customers, and that ranges from some of the small business customers that we have in the hundreds, right up to protecting the biggest organizations in the world, some of which with millions of mailboxes across their customers. And up until a month ago, I'd have said it's business as usual. We've seen no change in the landscape from a volume perspective. We've seen really no change in the types of threats. It's a mixture of malware, credential phishing, some imposter impersonation-based attacks, otherwise known as BEC. But actually, something very interesting has happened in the last 4 weeks, and that is that we've suddenly seen a huge increase in volumes. Now, again, that's spread across each of the attack types. As you can see here, the different colors represent the different types. And I think that's quite an interesting observation. Why this has happened? Well, we believe that this has happened because they've spent a number of months now understanding what does and doesn't work, trying different lures around the pandemic, and they know that they are seeing a huge increase in click rates across people. Ultimately, 99% of the malware-based attacks we see actually require the people within your organization to actually do something. And that's part of the problem that we face is how do we safeguard and help people protect their organizations better? I think on the flip side, if I show this second chart very quickly, this is the same representation, but actually by threat actor. So we see a number of different threat actors out there. Interestingly, one particular threat actor has been more prevalent and has been part of the reason why we've seen this spike. But the key thing is across each of the different threat actors, the main threat actors we track, all of them have been using COVID-based lures. And there's examples here across the board from each of these different main threat actors. We've got fake bills, we've got World Health Organization based lures, and I'll share some of these shortly. But this is the fundamental change that we have seen. They have realized that it's extremely effective to trick people by talking about the pandemic.
Yeah, there's some very interesting things there. Obviously, lots of different attacks, those different types of users. For your existing customers, though, what changes have you started to see with those in terms of how they change their security program to react to these new COVID lures?
Yeah, and as part of my role, I talk to large customers day in, day out. And I think for the first month or two, they were asking for insights. They were asking us to keep them up to date. And actually, we started a weekly series of briefings around the changing landscape and the lures to keep an eye out for. But actually, in the last month, the conversations have shifted, and generally, customers are now asking me, for advice on how to take a lot of the visibility and data that we give them day in, day out, and help understand what their new risk is. I think organizations generally now appreciate that they've had this big shift. They've got a lot more people working from home, but not that they neglected security, but it was second to getting people productive. And I think now is the time that many organizations are now saying, right, let's reassess our risk. This is going to be the norm. We're going to have lots of people remote for at least 6 months or so, if not for good. What extra risk have we exposed ourselves to? So one of the main things that our customers have been doing is taking our data, and we have a model where we profile who are the very attacked people. Not only that, but are they privileged users that have access that the threat actors need, and also are they vulnerable, and piecing that all together. And that's the approach that a lot of our customers are now taking is, right, what did this look like, say, 6 months ago, and then benchmarking that against what they're seeing, today in terms of user susceptibility.
Yeah. And obviously, that kind of risk exposure is quite important to understand, where you assess risk. I always approach security projects from a risk-based point of view. Do you have any more detail around, you talked about very attacked persons in terms of the visibility around there. Do you have any more information around, how that looks? Or
Yeah, and we have a model that we use here that we work through with our customers. And it really focuses around these three areas. Very attack people also stands for vulnerability, attack, and privilege, which is a great way of people remembering the three areas. So, it starts with understanding who are the people that are most attacked in your organization. And I'm not talking about simply volume. I'm not talking about the person that receives 600 credential phishes trying to steal their PayPal login. The thing is, that isn't going to have a huge business impact. Okay, that person will most likely have a bad day when their PayPal account gets accessed, but the business risk of that threat is very low. However, on the opposite side of the spectrum, you've got a, say, nation state threat actor. They're targeting an automotive company, and they're targeting a series of engineers. That is a very different risk profile. They're trying to drop a remote access Trojan, maybe, that is very sophisticated, hardly ever seen. That score's very different. So this concept of an attack index really helps people drill down into understanding not just volume, because of course that plays a part, but the sophistication of these attacks. And then you can understand who and where that risk lies. And interestingly, it's an exponential curve when we actually plot this out. So the top 5% of people within an organization typically represent over 50% of the risk that organization faces. So this allows organizations to start going from maybe a one-size-fits-all approach to actually start tailoring their controls and tailoring how they respond and alert to the maybe alerts and triggers that are coming in. But of course, understanding who's very attacked isn't just the one thing we need to look at. We need to understand, are they a privileged user? If they're attacking the wrong people and the people they're attacking with that remote access Trojan don't have access to that sensitive data, then again, the risk is reduced, right? But if they are the right people, then you've got two of the three aspects here. And then you're reliant on, is the technology good enough to block it when it comes in? And actually, there's a lot of threats that will only turn malicious after delivery. Take a URL, for instance. That can be clean on delivery and then turn bad later. So you then need to understand, are they also vulnerable? If there's somebody that clicks, then ultimately you've got the smoking gun there. You've got all three of those aspects. And that's what we help organizations understand. From a people-based perspective, where does your highest level of risk lie? And then the next step is obviously, how do you do something about it?
Yeah, no, I like this because I think approach is very key in addressing risk, and you obviously got a set of things like questions and a methodology that you follow to help obviously protect organizations and understand where their risks lie, which I think is really important. So once we actually go through this from a methodology point of view, what kind of typical controls would you see look to be implemented after this type of assessment?
I think that really depends on the types of attacks, and just very quickly, because I think this leads into this discussion nicely, which is, here's an example, and I'm just going to pick two out here. The second one, Elizabeth Davis, Director of Engineering. She's broadly attacked by a large number of different types of threats. So very hard to put a distinct control on her. But William Garcia specifically, he is heavily attacked by just malware-based threats. So there's a series of things that you can do there. Even simple things like, actually, you're going to turn off admin rights for him on his laptop. That's mitigating the risk. It's simple. You can't do it for everybody, but this allows you to be targeted in that type of attack. Equally, once you can understand the types of lures he's facing, malware typically requires the user to run a macro in Word or download and execute the payload. You specifically target the training on that user, and you can do this either manually or in an automated way. So you can build a rule set, for instance, that says, if somebody appears on this list, top 50 list, and they're heavily attacked with malware, give them this particular training module to take. That way, and tell them it's because they're being attacked in this way. We take one further down here, say an example of somebody that's heavily credential phished. A great control there would be to tie into Okta. We've got a technical partnership and a back-end integration with Okta. So maybe you actually have step-up authentication. You have greater levels of monitoring, greater levels of control around how and where that person can access into the systems from. At the same time, from a response point of view, that person clicks on a credential phish that you identify, then automatically tell Okta to provide step-up authentication on the next connection and force a password reset immediately. So you validate it is the right person, and then you force a password change, and you can automate that risk mitigation. So, just one key example of how we can approach this from a control point of view.
Yeah, and I actually really like that. I mean, I spoke about earlier about how protecting identity is really important as well. So that whole integration with Okta, I find very, very valuable, especially for organisations that have that or are looking to introduce MFA. I think that's a valuable additional piece of security there and integration that customers can take advantage of. So obviously, approach, methodology, looking at risk, I think it is great. I think from my point of view, there's always two ways to approach this. There's actually putting in the technology itself to help protect and help prevent these types of malware and phishing attacks, actually reaching the end user. But ultimately, nothing's 100%. So, I think the other part of this is really around, training, and actually making people aware of what they should be doing or how they should be actually looking at emails they're not 100% sure about. So in terms of, maybe building a training program, how would you go around that for an organization?
Yeah, and that's an interesting topic in itself, especially when it comes to training. I think even personally, if I think back to a few years ago, I'd get an email once a year that said, "Hey, you've got to take this 3 hours of training within the next 2 weeks, or your manager will be notified." That's not incentivizing me to take the training and to help the organization. However, if we think about actually understanding who we need to train and on what, then you then give them training throughout the year. So typically I speak to organizations and I ask them the same question. How long can you spend? How many hours a year can you allocate to training? And it's typically somewhere between 2 and 3. So instead of using this once a year, divide it up into small chunks, because somebody's much more likely to take a 10-minute training module once a month than they are to do a whole series in one go. That also means that you can actually train them on the specific threats they're facing. But the key thing to this is to automate this, and you can only automate this sort of thing if you get the visibility into how they're being attacked and to tie that into whether or not they're vulnerable. So, run phishing simulation-based attacks against certain people with real lures that we've seen in the wild that are facing that individual. If somebody is heavily credential phished, look and see the types, run a particular threat sim against credential phishing for that user. There's no point running one that's based around business email compromise if they're not facing that type of attack. So it's about building this up by profiling people, automating the types of attacks, and automating how you assign phishing simulation to that group and how you assign the training based on those results. So how are they being attacked? Understanding whether they're vulnerable based on phishing simulation, whether or not they're in the top clickers list if you're running some sort of click time protection. And that's really where you get to this model that is really effective, especially if you can actually tell them, we're asking you to do this training because you are actually being attacked by this type of threat. That actually changes the game, because individuals then actually understand it. This is really going to make a difference to the company because they've actually told me that this is something I'm facing. And we see that the effectiveness increases. So we can measure those metrics in a couple of ways. Firstly, are they clicking on stuff when you retest them? But actually, a really interesting metric is if you deploy what we call our fish alarm button, which is basically a reporting tool. It's a one-click button in Outlook. If you see a big increase in people submitting threats, that's a great way of assessing that your training is effective.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I mean, there's having been, we do phishing simulations ourselves, and inside our organisation, and
Yeah.
the ones I receive are either really easy to spot. B, they for me it's quite easy to delete because they're not really targeted or crafted to me. They're crafted to everyone. And inside large organisations, and we're 1,300 users in the UK. Unless you have that targeted approach, you're not going to get the best results. So I definitely agree with that, and it's great to see that we can actually do that with Proofpoint. And I think also, for the customers out there, now is a really good time, I find, for actually doing these kind of simulations. One, because I do find more people are spending more time behind their devices, which does ultimately mean that they've got more time to look at these things. But also from a training point of view, I think it's good to get the training simulation or training programs out there, because everyone wants a kind of break from what they're doing day to day. I know myself, 15 weeks from home, 5 days a week. Doing things different actually does break up your day and helps as well with the mental side of things. So no, definitely a great time. In terms of those types of assessments as well, we need to actually look at how we assess users and our customers. I know Proofpoint have got a range of assessments. Can you outline what those provide and how they can benefit our customers?
Yeah, and we're running a number of these for both our customers and other organisations that aren't yet customers of Proofpoint right now, and they really fall into three brackets, and you can run all three. But to break them down, the first one is our threat assessment, which is really looking at two things. It's looking at threats against that are coming in via email and coming in via cloud. That's something that can be set up really quickly and easily. It takes about an hour of an administrator's time within a company. And then we leave it running for a couple of weeks. We do all of the heavy lift alongside CDW to then come back and actually present that data. And that includes that very attacked person breakdown that I actually showed in a slide earlier as well, to give people that insight, which are, typically organizations haven't had prior. And then the second key assessment is our people-focused assessment, where we can actually, on a one-off basis, actually run a single phishing simulation exercise, potentially run a one-off security assessment that really just gives you that baseline to help you understand whether or not that risk exists, but also benchmark that. So we can benchmark that against maybe other companies within the UK, or other companies within your sector, which actually might be even more useful. If you're in the finance sector, what's the typical failure rate of this type of threat across most finance customers? And that'll help you benchmark where you are. Maybe you've got an in-house program today and it's doing really well. Maybe it highlights actually that there's a better way of achieving security awareness training. So those two assessment types, they can be run together. Or the threat and the people-based one can be run separately. From the threat side, it also looks at email account compromise, which we didn't touch on earlier, but we see it's grown quite an alarming rate through this period of time. I think that's really borne by the fact that people are working off network. It's much harder to spot logins coming from external locations now, where actually it would be fairly easy before, because people are so spread out now, accessing from a number of different locations. So that's part of that as well. Is there a risk of people trying to brute force into your Office 365 login accounts, or trying intelligent variants from recent breaches?
Yeah, that's good. And to be honest, I'm a big fan of assessments where they're unintrusive as well, and and don't take much heavy lifting to put in place. I think they can add a lot of value to customers, and with I say little effort, but with minimal kind of effort and time from their side as well. I mean, in summary, I think for myself, we've spoken about the risk to the users is probably is more important now to address than ever. Even recent statistics, from Gartner and other reports show that, I've seen, 90% of breaches involve emails used as some form of attack or used in that process, and compromised credentials at 80%. So it is definitely more important than ever now to actually start addressing the issues at the user and at the device as well. And no doubt, email security, that whole threat detection piece around phishing and malware and education is really important. I mean, Richard, have you got anything else you want to add to kind of the summary and approach really, and how we should be looking at this?
Yeah, and really, you touched on it earlier on in our chat as well, which is, getting this balance between technology and people. And if we think about it from a kind of a recommendation point of view, we can really talk about it from a technology point of view. So, to address this, we first and foremost need to deploy something that's going to do the best job of detecting threats as they come in. That's through email, it's through webmail. We're seeing a growing trend of email account compromises I talked about. But you also need to think about, right, how are we protecting URLs at click time that aren't bad at the point that they come in? And, there's plenty of technology out there that will provide solutions there as well. But one very interesting newer piece of technology that can really help, certainly on a more targeted basis, is to use things like browser isolation. That can not only log down webmail, which is a threat, because right now people are using one machine for everything right at home. They've probably got Gmail open, checking their personal email at the same time. So things like browser isolation can really help. Allow them to get access to places, but reduce the risk by isolating that up in a cloud browser until you know it's clean, when you can give them full access. And you can apply that to every single URL that comes in via email as well. And that's something that's really useful for maybe that top 50 set of very attacked people, where actually there is a trade-off between reducing risk and business impact. Browser isolation does have an impact on how you use things, but it can be used intelligently once you've got the visibility into how to use it. I touched on monitoring for account compromise earlier as well. But the other thing to also think about, I know I've talked to a number of organizations who are reappraising what they do from remote access, is to consider cloud-based technology now that has this, it's built around the principles of zero trust, i.e. we're only going to provide access into the resources you actually need. And we're not going to allow wider access, because that helps reduce that risk against the network as well. And then on the people side, we talked about this earlier again, but just to highlight, understand who your most attacked people are. Undertake phishing simulation, but I say with caution, because I think we need to be a little bit careful here, because I think a lot of people are on edge. So I don't personally recommend using COVID-specific lures here. I think that's something that people can assess themselves, and then utilize that relevant training based on the specific threats they face. But then there's a couple of other things that I think are really useful outside of this right now. And I've been talking about this for some time. It still amazes me that people get caught out with business email compromise attacks around wire transfers. A very simple way to mitigate this is to enforce a policy of out-of-band confirmation. You have to confirm that transfer request outside of email, whether it's just a simple message, an IM on Teams or whatever tool you use, just something that validates separately with that person outside of email. And that can greatly reduce this risk of BC, especially when people are working from home. They can't just shout across the office anymore. Typically where somebody would just wander out and say, "Can you do this transfer?" So that becomes even more important. And then one other thing which I've recommended to a lot of companies, especially around communicating with this going back to work thing, is to communicate that you will not send any links or attachments regarding back to work and this process, that everything will be on a central repository. And if you send an update out, it will say what the update is and ask people to log into the core portal, wherever you're hosting that information, to pull down that. And that greatly reduces this risk of these lures. Simply say, if you get anything that purports to come from us that has a link or an attachment, don't click it. And that greatly mitigates the risk of these types of threats. That's something that people can take forward after this as well.
Yeah, no, thanks, Rich. That's very very highlighting as well. I mean, yeah, technology and people. We should have had something about process maybe, then we could have had the full people, process, technology triangle.
Exactly right. I included process in with the people bit to an extent. So
Yeah.
I've got you covered.
Yeah. Obviously, process is more about understanding what you do when you see an attack and how you can respond to that as well as part of your own internal processes. So,
Yeah.
no doubt. Look, understanding risk, running assessments to actually help reduce that risk, and then putting in a range of technology and awareness programs. It is definitely the best way to approach this. Obviously with Proofpoint and CDW together, we're able to deliver these types of assessments. We've got a dedicated security practice as well to help you understand more about that risk profiling and go through these steps. Unless Rich, have you got any final words for this? Otherwise, we can close off.
No. I think just highlighting the assessment piece. The CDW team, obviously, you run a very large security practice, so are really well placed to actually help with these assessments as well, as along with the other services that you offer. But there's a couple of documents that I'd also suggest people read. We've got our yearly human factor report. We haven't published the 2021, but the 2019 one provides quite an interesting background to last year. But we've just published a new user risk report for 2020. And that includes information on what we've seen through the pandemic as well. So I think both of those, if people want more of an understanding, are great documents to download. And obviously from a free assessment perspective, they can contact their CDW account managers. There's no need to come directly through our form. Just speak to your CDW account manager.
Yeah, no, that's great. And Rich, thanks for your time today. It's been it's definitely a very interesting topic and quite close to my heart. This around actually protecting identity and users for sure. As Rich said, we can help you with these assessments. So yeah, unless there's any questions, I'll wait. If there's any questions, then we'll look to close off in a minute. You've got a lot of solutions. There's obviously a lot of ways that Proofpoint can help our customers, which is great. You've got a great portfolio, some very good acquisitions over the years as well, and some good technology advancements there. So I don't know if there's anything you want to talk about the solutions, Rich. Or...
I just thought I'd leave that up at the end, because I know that a number of even some of our own customers don't realize the breadth of our portfolio. Yeah. Certainly, historically they see us as the market-leading email vendor, but our suite of solutions encompasses not only access protection, things like browser isolation and network access, but a growing area of our portfolio is around the user protection piece. Yeah, especially with the Observe It acquisition we made, that gave us that insider threat management piece. So from an information protection point of view, we can now cover email, cloud, and endpoint. So we've got a very nice broad coverage to look for not only sensitive documents, but also to look at behavior. So user behavior, which obviously a good indication as to the risk there. So yeah. So I want to thank everybody for their time today, first and foremost. It's been a pleasure to come on and chat to you, Richard. We should do this again.
Yes, no doubt. No doubt we shall. So yeah, no, again, thanks for your time. Thanks to everyone who's attended today. I know it's half an hour out of your day. Hopefully it's been worth it. And yeah, I look forward to speaking to you soon. As Richard, if any information you require going forward, then please get in contact with your CDW account manager. So thank you.
No problem. Thanks everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks everyone.